Hello! My mom is very supportive of me exploring sewing and sewing clothes and my interest in historical clothing specifically. So a couple of months ago she got me this pattern. It's a McCall's vintage reproduction pattern, I think. So it's like a modernized version of a pattern that they actually released in the 50s. It's from the archive collection, it says, and it's circa 1955. You can see here. And my mom got it. She thought it would be a fairly easy pattern. It turned out it's a bit complicated, but she thought I would look really cute in this dress, and I agree. So I'm going to make this. I've already transferred the size I wanted to another paper. I used size 6. I'm a little bit worried that it's going to be a bit too small. It might be. It fits perfectly on the mock-up, but my mock-up fabric has failed me once before on another mock-up. I also don't want to pick a larger size because I don't want the dress to look baggy. So I'm going to just cut out size 6 of this dress, and I have a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, so if it turns out to be a bit too small I can always let it out at certain points, since it has quite a bit of seam allowance. I got this light blue white fabric, and I got it for 25 Swedish crowns a meter, and I bought 4 meters, which makes it 100 Swedish crowns. So it should be plenty for the dress, I think. So when I found my fabric, I just made a sketch of the dress, and just to figure out if this was going to work for the dress I wanted to make, and I thought it looked great. As you can see in the sketch, I left the cuffs and the collar white. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that on the dress or if I'm going to use the same fabric to do the cuff and the collar. I'm not sure yet, so I'm going to leave that until I have to think about it. So I'm going to start cutting out the pieces and applying the interfacing and stuff like that. So let's see how this turns out. It's actually pretty tricky. So I've finished cutting out the pieces except from the interfacing, the collar and the cuffs. As you can see, here are the pieces. These ones are going to be interfaced. This is the facing, and these are the front pieces and the front of the skirt. This is the back of the skirt. This is the back of the bodice part. That piece and that piece are going at the side, and I haven't cut out the collar or cuffs yet, because I can't decide if I want to make it in this fabric or if I want to add in this dark, the collar and cuff in this dark red, or maybe I want a white collar and cuff. Now that I'm looking at it, and this is a cotton sateen fabric, I think it's going to stand out a bit too much. I get this pale blue, so I guess that one's out. I can't decide if I want it to be white or not. Yeah, so I'm going to just keep on sewing and save the collar and cuffs for later on when I have more of the dress sewn, and I can just figure it out then. I hope. I'm feeling really indecisive about this. I don't know what's going to fit. So yeah, I'm gonna move on with sewing together the pieces. So I started out with using a ladder stitch for my fish-eye darts on the side pieces, just to keep them together when I sew them on the machine later on. I find it really useful just to make that ladder stitch and just make sure they are lined up properly. And then I'm cutting out bias squares to use as reinforcement, and I'm transferring the markings from the pattern onto my squares, so I'm sewing at the right spot later on. And then I'm attaching my squares to the pivot points on what's going to be the front and back pieces and the sleeves. And then I'm pinning together pieces that I can pin together so far, which are the skirt back pieces. And then I'm sewing on the bias squares, and I'm just making sure to be careful with not getting anything bunched up underneath them. Then I'm sewing together the skirt back pieces and sewing the fish-eye darts in the side pieces. And then I'm pinning the side pieces together at the side seam. And I'm pinning the back pieces together at the center back seam. And then I'm sewing those seams. And then I'm carefully clipping up to that pivot point on my bias squares and moving the squares over to the other side. This part is a bit fiddly and you just have to work on it until you figure out how it's supposed to go. And then I'm ironing that down and ironing out the center back seam of the skirt and folding over the seam allowance so I can then pin it and sew it with a zigzag stitch. And then I'm doing the same thing for the side seams. And then I'm folding the bias squares on the back pieces and fixing up the center back seam. So now I'm sewing the zigzag stitch on the seam allowance. Okay, so I've sewn together the pieces I can so far. And I had a bit of a problem with the fabric fraying because it's not so tightly woven. It just wants to like fray apart at the straight parts. It's okay at bias, but as fabric is. So when I did the finishing on the seam allowance, I instead of turning over under the seam allowance and sewing a straight seam to keep that fold together, I used a zigzag stitch to help with the fraying, and I think it worked out fine. I'm now going to baste down the seam allowance, and then I'm going to sew down the seam allowance so it lies nice and neat, and when you wash the dress it won't scrunch up, it will be like flat against the fabric. Yeah, so I'm just basting down my seam allowances, and here I'm doing both seam allowances at the same time. And then I'm basting the fisheye darts, just to keep everything in place when I'm going to go in and hand sew down my seam allowances later on. And then I'm sewing those down, and I'm just picking up 1 or 2 threads on the outside. So when I'm done with this, on this fabric it was completely invisible, you can't see where I've sewn them down. And I find this just helps with making the clothes more comfortable, and also you don't have to iron down your seam allowances after you have washed your clothes. And then I'm stay stitching the front pieces just a couple of millimeters outside of my seam line. So it's going to be on the seam allowance when I've sewn together pieces, not visible on the actual clothes later on. And then I'm attaching some iron-on interfacing to my facing. It's a woven cotton interfacing, and I'm just ironing it on using an old pillowcase as a pressing cloth that I've dampened with a spray bottle. And then I'm ironing on interfacing onto the collar as well. Then I'm stay stitching a couple of points on the collar, sewing the cuffs and sewing the side seams of the skirt, leaving a opening for my pockets. And then I'm zigzagging the openings in my pockets. I'm clipping a part of the collar after the instructions, and I'm stay stitching the facing. I fold up the seam allowance on the collar between the points that I've clipped, and then I press that with the iron and cut away 5 millimeters of the seam allowance. Then I put the collar together and pin it. I iron up the seams of the cuffs and trim away the seam allowance. Then I fold up the edge of the facing that is going to be away from the buttons later on, and then I pin that down. I iron open the side seams and attach the facing on my pocket. And then I sew down the folded up part of the facing with a zigzag stitch, and sew on the facing on my pockets also with a zigzag stitch. Just for the frame problem I had, I thought the zigzag stitch was safer. Okay, so I'm going to put in the pocket here, and I'm going to do the side that is sewn into the side seam first, and I'm just going to line these. I think the pocket slit might be a tad too short for what I cut out of the pocket. I think the pocket slits might be a bit short. Can you see this is how it's going to look on the outside? That looks better than I thought it would. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to want to be able to sew this on my machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this like this, put a finger between so I just get one layer, make sure the pocket slit is aligned properly, and then put my pin here. Nope, I managed to catch both. Like that, so. Yeah, so I'm just pinning the pocket to that seam allowance. And then I'm sewing it down with a zipper foot, first using a zigzag stitch, and then I'm going to go back again and sew with a straight stitch as close to the fold of the seam as possible, so it just blends in with the side seam. And then I'm sewing gathering stitches. I start at the marking on the first front piece, and then I start and stop every time I get to a seam, and then I stop for the last time at the marking at the second front piece. And after I'm done with my first line of gatherers, which are a little bit inside of my seam allowance, I do a second row a bit outside the seam allowance. So that part is going to be visible until I remove them, but that will keep everything nicely in place when I sew down the gatherers later on. And then I appear to be missing the footage where I sew together the underarm seam, but be reassured that I have done that. And here I am pinning together the side pieces with the back pieces. So at the back side seams, fiddling around a bit where I come to the bias square, and then I'm sewing those side back seams and finishing them like I've done with the other seam allowances. As you can see, I hope underneath my cat, I have attached the side pieces to the back pieces. Now I'm going to do the big job, which is attaching the front pieces to the back pieces, as well as the skirt to the bottom edge of the back and side pieces. So this entire mass of fabric is going to be attached to this piece that my cat is sitting on. This bottom part is going to be gathered to this in one go. So I'm going to be sewing from, I'm going to show the other side. I'm going to be going from here at the armhole, attaching these together, and then I'm going from this marking, and you can see the corresponding marking on the front piece, from here to how it looks on the other side. I'm going to gather all this fabric to this, so I'm going to be sewing it all together. So I'm going to get on I'm going to get on with pinning and gathering, and we shall see how that works. Oh, and I wanted to mention about the pockets. As you can see, they aren't attached anywhere else except for just opening. And that is so when I gather down the fabric, I can then lay the pocket on top of it and it's no extra it adds no extra thickness to the outer fabric. So the gatherers are going to help hide the pocket opening. Hopefully. We shall see how that works. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just attaching the front pieces and the back pieces with the skirt. It's kind of weird to explain. And I'm starting out with attaching the side front seams where it's all straight, and then I'm pinning down the notches and the seams of the skirt pieces and the back pieces and side pieces where it is appropriate to do so, and then I'm pinning the loose fabric between that until I have it all evened out, and then I'm starting to pull the gatherers together and pinning them down. And it took me quite a while, and it was fiddly and very bulky to deal with, all this fabric, and I had to fiddle around with it for quite a while until I had everything as it should be. And then I just sewed that down, being very careful of that bias square, and being very careful with the fabric that laid underneath the gatherers to make sure there was no bubbliness of the fabric or anything like that, so that my side pieces and my back pieces are smooth where they come up from the gatherers. And then I pinned down the pockets, which I had not sewn down previously, and I pinned down that pocket tape, and I sewed them down over the seam of the skirt. Okay, so now I'm going to do the underarm part of the sleeve, and I just wanted to show you guys, this is the back panel, these are the side panels, and this is the front panel. And here previously we sewed together the underarm, and here comes the interesting part. You can see the front and the back are connected by the underarm, and this is actually where your armpit is going to be. So what you're going to do is you fold, you have the right side of the fabric against the right side of the fabric after you have folded it, like this, and then you're going to pin at the notches as usual. So what you're going to do here is do the other part of the pivot point, the pivot point that you made the bias square for. So you're going to be sewing here, and it's going to be a bit fiddly. I've already done one, and I got it worked out so it looks good on both sides. I just had to unpick here at the pivot point once because I couldn't get it aligned properly, but after I had sewn the rest, I could go back and unpick that and sew that again. This time I'm going to try to do it in one go, so we'll see how that goes. Yeah, so I'm just pinning that armpit seam. Can't figure out a better way to explain it. And you have to fiddle a while and be very careful. And then I'm sewing that seam, being very careful. I still had to seam rip a little bit and go back in again, but I got most of it on the first go. You just have to try until it works. And then I sewed the shoulder seams, and then I stay stitched that part of the facing that is going to attach to the collar. I ironed open the seams and finished off the seam allowance as I showed previously. It's hard to iron those curves. And then I sewed a second stitch further in the seam allowance on the armpit seams and on the skirt seams, following the instruction that McCall gave in their sewing instructions. And then I'm trimming off that excess fabric on the seam allowance. And then I'm zigzag stitching those raw seams just to be super careful to not have any fraying. And I found that this worked really well, both at the armpit seam and at the skirt seam. And then I'm ironing the seam allowance on the skirt and pinning it down so I can sew it down later on, and then ironing the front side seams open and clipping it where it's necessary. Then I'm attaching the cuffs to the sleeves. And here I'm stay stitching around the neck opening, just a couple of millimeters into the seam allowance from the seam line. And then I'm attaching the cuffs. The cuffs are cut on the bias, so you have to be careful not to stretch them so it turns out weird. And then I'm sewing a second row stitches further into the seam allowance and then trimming that down. Now I'm attaching the collar to the neck opening. And sewing it down, making sure not to catch that part of the seam allowance that I folded up. So I'm just carefully sewing with that pushed back. And then I'm folding up my cuffs and ironing them and pinning them. I'm folding up the seam allowance at the top of the facing and pinning the facing to my dress. And then I'm carefully sewing down the facing, following the instructions. And then I'm trimming down the seam allowance and notching in the seam allowance at the collar, following the instructions. And then I'm folding in the facing. And then I'm carefully understitching the facing to the seam allowance. Ironing the collar and pinning it. Ironing and fiddling with the facing. And then I'm hand stitching down the collar to the back of the dress, and I'm just doing this for the part that I had previously clipped and folded over. And this will make it so that the back of the collar is going to be wanting to be standing out. Okay, so this project requires you to make a bunch of buttonholes, since it closes with buttons in the front, and I really don't want to do them by hand. And while my sewing machine have a buttonhole function, I have not been able to make it work on an actual project. I can make it work when I test it out on exactly the same fabric, in the same thickness, with layers and stuff. It works fine. When I do it on the project, it doesn't work out fine. And I haven't managed to figure out why I'm having this problem. So I'm going to go home to my parents, and my mom is going to help me do them on her machine, because she has like an attachment to the sewing machine that helps you make the buttonhole, and she's had a lot of success with that. So I'm gonna do them on her machine. Okay, so I'm at my parents now, and this is the thing I was talking about. So you like put the button here, and this thing knows how big the buttonhole needs to be. So I'm gonna ask my mom to hold the camera while I do one. Yeah. And now it's on to the nerve-wracking task of opening up all these buttonholes. I'm gonna take it slowly and very carefully, and let's just hope that it's going to be okay. Yeah, so what I'm doing here, you can see the buttonhole here. What I'm doing is I'm first using my seam ripper, and I'm opening up at one edge, keeping the side of the seam ripper, the back of the seam ripper, against the end of the buttonhole. And then I'm taking my embroidery scissors, and I'm carefully cutting open the buttonhole between those openings to make sure I don't screw up the stitching. And here I'm gonna take this, and I'm going to really carefully, yeah, and then I'm going to test the buttonhole. Wonderful! And now I'm sewing on the buttons. is showing up. Sometimes Suko just jumps on my desk, and sometimes he just wants to walk around, and sometimes it just means he wants to hang out on my shoulders and don't know how to ask for it. This time he wanted to walk around on my desk, which I don't want him to do when I have so many needles around. Hey guys, I'm done with the buttons, as you can see, and there has been some weirdness with the dress. This dress form that I've put it on is made, it's a duct tape dress form that is made, was made of me years ago, and I was a bit smaller then, and you can see it's hanging really loosely. And the thing is, the size of the dress that this is the smallest size in petite that is available for this dress, and you can see it's hanging a bit very loosely on this dress form, like you can, yeah. And I thought it fit me pretty great when I had it on me. The thing is, when I have it on me, this weird gaping thing that's happening here is a lot more pronounced, and it's also straining. No, it's not straining, it just looks like it's straining, because it fits me very comfortably, and it's I mean, it's a tiny bit snug, it's not massively snug. It's like it feels like my perfect size for having a bit of a nipped in waist. The thing is, I mean, it fits great after my over my hips and over my bust, but here, from here down to here, between the buttons, they sort of pop out, and you get sort of, you can see it even here, you get this weird curve. And I don't know why that is happening, and it's happening even now when it's hanging quite loosely. I thought it was because I was supposed to make a bigger size, but it's not that. It's just something weird. I'm thinking it might have something to do with the fact that I have maybe a bit more of a thicker fabric that was meant for this dress. So anyway, oh, please ignore this. I have a blood stain on the dress from where I punctured my finger with a needle. So I'm just wetting that and hoping I can work it out. Anyway, I put in snaps. If you've seen my purple history bounding dress, you can you know that I'm a big fan of snaps. So I put those on so I can snap it all together like that, and it sits a lot better on me. It's just that it's still a bit here with the snaps. You can sort of, when it pulls, you get this sort of a little bit. You can see the facing. So I might put just a couple of stitches over here as invisibly as I can to help with that. But you're going to see in the reveal. I think it fits beautifully except for this weirdness. Then I'm also going to have to fix the hem, because for some reason, God, I hope that reason and this reason isn't related in some way that I can't figure out. Anyway, the hem on this side is further down than on this side, so I'm going to even them out. Yeah, so I evened out that hem, and I now sewing down the underside of the facing to the hem and trimming that back, following these instructions, and then I'm folding out that corner. Then I just folded up about 1 centimeter of the hem and I'm sewing that down with a zigzag stitch, and then I'm folding up the rest of that hem using that bit I cut off as a guide, and I'm just ironing that down. And then I'm hand stitching down the lower part of the facing and the hem. I'm using a rather large stitch length attaching the hem, but I'm just picking up 2-3 stitches on the outside, so it's fairly invisible. I don't think you can see it at all on the outside. And then I am done with the dress, finally. And here you can see some footage of the finished dress, helpfully filmed by my dad. Thank you, Dad. And you can see here the solution I made with the snap buttons, how it looks without them being snapped and how it looks with them snapped together. There you can see the pivot points. They turned out great, even though they were a lot of work, and how it looks with the collar open and closed. So I'm finished with the dress. It took way longer than I thought it would, and it was a bit of a struggle at times. But I'm really happy with it. I managed to fix the weirdness here by both doing these extra snap buttons and tacking down the facing. Yeah, so I still have some finishings to the seams on the inside left to do, but those are mostly unnecessary. It's just because I prefer to have them completely tacked down and finished nicely on the inside, because it limits the amount of chafing that's going to happen against my body, and increases the likelihood of me wanting to wear it. So if you can see me sweating profusely, it's super hot in Sweden right now. Thankfully my dad, who's a really great photographer, helped me with filming and taking photos for the reveal. Yes, so I made this bow out of the small fabric scraps I had left over, so I can save up the big ones for making some kind of future project. So it's pieced and stuff. I think it turned out really cute, and I attached a bobby pin to the back side, so I can just slide it in above my ponytail. Yeah, so the part that I enjoyed most about this dress is how it turned out when it was finished. I love the color, and I love how the pockets are invisible. I love the swooshiness of the skirt, and I can enjoy the cuffs also. I think it looks really cute. Yeah, the part that I enjoyed the least about this dress was the reinforcement squares and this whole business. It was sort of difficult to work with. You had to fiddle around with it a lot. And also when you put the front pieces and the back skirt pieces together, it was so much fabric to work with, and it was all attached to these slim pieces that had these really vulnerable spots on them, and I wasn't super happy about that. I found that a bit unsettling to move around with, and it was a bit heavy to work with. But it turned out good. I really love how this dress turned out, and my mom is really happy. She really likes how I look in it. So that's great because she bought me the pattern. So it's nice that she's happy with my version of it. If you're interested in my future videos, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so YouTube will let you know when that comes up. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and let me know. May the stars shine upon your faces and have a glorious day. Thank you and goodbye for now.